Mary Shelley was 18 when she wrote Frankenstein. Her mother died of childbirth complications 11 days after Mary was born. By 17, Shelley had lost her first baby. By the time she sat down in the summer of 1816 for a ghost story competition with Byron and Percy, she had already lived inside the question her novel would spend 2 centuries asking: what does a creator owe the thing they bring into existence? The novel that emerged from that summer is almost universally read through a single frame. A scientist reaches past the proper limits of human knowledge, builds something monstrous, and pays for it. James Whale's 1931 film fixed the image. Boris Karloff in a flat-topped skull with bolts at the temples, and over 90 screen adaptations since have reproduced its essential argument. The laboratory is where the horror begins, ambition is the crime, and the lesson is that science requires limits. But the rupture in Shelley's novel happens in a bedroom on the morning after the creation, when Victor Frankenstein looks at the creature he has just made and runs. No scientific principle is violated in that moment. No boundary of human knowledge is crossed. A being opens its eyes, reaches towards the person whose making it was, and is abandoned. Every crime in that novel follows from that abandonment with a logic that Shelley traces precisely, causally, and without mercy towards Victor or the creature. Shelley's argument is grounded in that room. She was asking whether bringing a conscious being into existence generates an obligation that cannot be discharged by walking away, whether the creator's horror at what they have made releases them from what they owe. The creature's answer, given across 40 pages of the novel's most powerful prose, is that it does not. The next 15 minutes or so are about how the wrong reading took hold, what Shelley's formal machinery actually does, and why the question she was posing at 18 has become more urgent as we've gotten better at making potentially conscious things. Let's set the stage. James Whale's 1931 Frankenstein is the adaptation that made everything else possible and foreclosed nearly everything that mattered. The flat-topped skull, the bolts, the laboratory full of arcing electrical current, that's not really in Shelley's novel. The creation sequence, which Shelley dispatches in roughly 3 pages of a 300-page book, takes up a significant portion of Whale's film. He made the laboratory legible, visible, and kinetic, and then handed that visual vocabulary to every subsequent filmmaker, even unintentionally. The creature's eloquence, his philosophical sophistication, his capacity for extended argument, his ability to deploy Paradise Lost and Plutarch and Gothic against Victor's self-justifications was removed entirely. Karloff's creature does not really speak. He communicates in grunts and gestures and expressions of confused, wounded animal rage. We can pity him. We cannot, however, engage with him as any sort of moral actor. The film systematically closes every route by which we might hear the creature's case against his creator. Kenneth Branagh's 1994 version, which advertised itself as the definitive adaptation and used Shelley's name in its title, ran Robert De Niro's creature with a measure of speech and some philosophical weight, but the film's energy remained organized around Victor, his obsession, his galvanizing ambition, his catastrophic pride. The creature's claim on Victor's attention is framed as a nemesis rather than a moral obligation. The 2025 version, directed by Guillermo del Toro, moved closer to the novel's emotional register, but still could not fully escape the creation as catastrophe frame that Whale invented. As we can see, every adaptation made the same choice. The scientist's story, told from the scientist's position, with the creature as a thing that comes from him. Even versions that humanized the creature moved it from threat to tragic figure without reaching what Shelley built him to be, a moral authority making a claim. What every version shares, the laboratory is the text, the abandonment is the subtext, the monster is what the film was made about. We arrive at the creation primed to understand that something terrible has been built. Shelley built the novel in 3 nested frames, and the nesting itself is a sort of argument. Robert Walton, an Arctic explorer writing letters to his sister, rescues Victor Frankenstein from the ice. Victor tells Walton his story. Embedded inside Victor's account is the creature's own narrative, his education, his attempts to connect with the human world, and the building toward a moment of acceptance. And then, the cascade of violence when that moment is destroyed. 3 narrators, each inside the one before. We arrive at the creature's voice only after Victor has spent a full volume establishing him as an object of horror. We carry Victor's disgust and terror into the creature's account. But the account dismantles it. The creature is articulate, philosophically precise, emotionally intelligent, and in command of texts that Victor never demonstrates he has fully read. His account of education, conducted alone in the forest, observing the DeLacy family through a crack in the wall, traces how he learns language, learns the structure of human relationships, and builds toward a single moment of contact he has prepared for months. Let's return back to the abandonment itself because Shelley is precise about it. The creature does not run from Victor. Victor runs from the creature twice. The first time is in the morning after the creation. Victor lying in bed, the creature entering the room, reaching toward him, and Victor fleeing into the courtyard. The creature's first experience of the world is rejection from the one person whose making it was. The second time is in Geneva, when the creature has tracked Victor down and proposed a specific arrangement. Build me a female companion and we remove ourselves from society entirely. Victor agrees, begins the work, and then destroys it in a moment of panic while the creature watches. The murders that follow are not animal rage. We are seeing the systematic response of a being who's been refused every alternative. We are meant to hold both of these at once, the wrongness of what the creature does, and the comprehensibility of how he arrived at it. Shelley gives us a villain whose violence is explicable and a hero whose horror is self-serving, and she doesn't resolve the tension between the two. Before we continue, channel memberships are open, members get early access, exclusive essays, and a backlog of 100+ older videos. Back to the video. The 3-layer frame does not translate to cinema by any straightforward means. Literary narrators can be nested. Walton's letters contain Victor's account and contain the creatures, and the reader holds all three perspectives simultaneously, aware at every moment of the distance between each narrator's version and whatever actually happened. Cinema, naturally, defaults to omniscient visual access. We see what is in front of the camera and we tend to believe it. The creature's eloquence compounds the problem. A creature who speaks with a philosophical precision and complete paragraphs looks wrong against the Karloff expectation. De Niro's performance in the Branagh version was received as bizarre and incongruous precisely because the visual grammar of the monster had already defined what the creature should be, and should be an eloquent philosopher did not overlap. There is a third problem that is specifically a studio problem, and is probably the most decisive of the three. The creature's argument, heard fairly, is the most persuasive argument in the novel. Giving it full screen space means building a film in which we are invited to agree with a murderer's case against its creator, which is exactly what Shelley does, and which requires an audience willing to sit with sustained moral discomfort rather than a satisfying arc. It only makes sense. The playing God reading produces a clean antagonist, a comprehensible moral, and a resolution. On the other hand, the abandonment reading produces a film with two defendants and a verdict the audience has to arrive at on their own. Wales film arrived in 1931 at the center of a cultural moment organized around a specific anxiety: what industrial modernity and scientific ambition were producing. The Promethean frame, the scientist destroyed by what he finds beyond the proper limits of knowledge, was the available story, and Wales' Frankenstein slotted into it perfectly. The abandonment reading, which requires a more uncomfortable kind of attention, did not. The 1831 revised edition of Shelley's novel helped consolidate this. The preface Shelley wrote for the revision, describing the ghost story competition, the conversations between Byron and Percy about galvanism and the reanimation of corpses, the waking dream that produced the novel's central image, emphasize the scientific provocation. It is the frame every reader now receives before the novel begins, and it primes the laboratory reading before the laboratory appears on page 1. Shelley herself, revising 13 years after the original publication, gave subsequent readers a way into the novel that moved away from the most unsettling argument. The Karloff image then fixed the visual so completely that what followed after was not really adaptation more than it was quotation. Every subsequent filmmaker began with a flat-top skull already in their heads and made decisions in relationship to that rather than in relationship to the text. And so, the adaptations are in dialogue with each other, each one responding to the previous visual tradition, and not with Shelley. And now we move to the novel's critical reception. The abandonment reading has existed in the academic Shelley scholarship for decades without crossing into the culture. Partly the visible monopoly of the whale template, partly the 1831 preface, partly the form of the argument. The abandonment reading produces a question rather than a warning, and the film-going public want answers more than they want questions. The sympathy transfer is the novel's technical achievement, and it operates almost entirely through the architecture of the three frames. By the time we reach the creature's voice in Volume 2, we have spent a full volume inside Victor's perspective. We know his grief, his terror, his elaborate self-justifications. We have watched him organizing his understanding of the creature's violence around the premise that he, Victor, is the creature's victim, that the arrangement of suffering is the creature's choice. We carry all of that into the creature's account. And the creature's account is designed to receive it, but then redirect it. Shelley gives him the best prose in the book. Victor is articulate, but self-serving. Walton is earnest, but limited in imagination. The creature's vocabulary is heightened, drawn from Milton, Plutarch, and Goethe. It's exact and emotionally precise in ways that Victor never achieves about anything. The passage in which the creature reads Paradise Lost is the novel's keystone. He recognizes himself as Adam, but Adam abandoned. He has come forth from the hands of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the special care of his creator. But I was wretched, helpless, and alone. The creature knows the story he is inside. This was clever on Shelley's part, giving him a moral consciousness that Victor refuses to acknowledge he has. Most interesting of all, the reason the transfer works is because we have earned our way into this account through the labor of attending, for a full volume, to his adversary's version. The creature's perspective is a correction, a recontextualization of everything we thought we understood, rather than as a late narrative reveal. Shelley was writing about a being who arrived in the world without requesting it, without any infrastructure of care guaranteed by the fact of his existence. But more broadly, the question she was asking is now the question we are asking about every conscious system we produce. Children, of course, but also the people institutions produce. The educational systems, the pharmaceutical companies. The creature's argument, I was benevolent and good, misery made me a fiend, is a structural claim about what a created being receives and what it becomes. The AI question has Shelley's architecture exactly. A system with something like consciousness is produced. Those doing the creating tend to reach for the playing God frame. The risk is in having built it, the concern is what the thing might do. The abandonment frame asks a harder question. What do we owe whatever we have made? AI is not there yet, but Shelley was asking this in 1818. We have gotten considerably better at making things that ask it back. The creature's final scene, Walton finds him weeping over Victor's body, is not a villain's monologue. He's accomplished what he set out to accomplish, and the completion has produced nothing. The organizing structure of his existence is gone. He announces his intention to go north, build a funeral pyre, and disappear. He's not captured, not reformed, and he's especially not given an answer. The novel ends with him rowing away into darkness and Walton turning his ship south, and the question hanging in the Arctic air without resolution. Shelley was 18 when she built this ending. She already understood that the honest version of her argument was a question rather than a verdict, and that the question would remain open regardless of what happened to either of the people inside it. What the original novel carries is not the monster and it's not the lesson. It is the creature's voice, the most philosophically precise voice in the novel, saying that it did not choose to exist, that it asked only for what it was owed, that it was refused at every turn, and that the refusal made it into what it had become. That is the argument. The laboratory was never the point. The last video looked at V for Vendetta, specifically at how the 2005 film took Alan Moore's original argument and turned it into something far more comfortable. The film rewrote the regime's origins, V's methods, and the ending, and in doing so converted a warning into a mythology. The mask became a symbol of exactly what Moore was warning against. That video is linked here. Subscribe to keep up with this Gothic series. Thanks for watching, and stay copacetic.